For decades, country music fans whispered about what really happened between Tanya Tucker and Glen Campbell, two icons whose love story played out like a Southern Gothic tragedy under the bright lights of Nashville. They were wild, passionate, chaotic, and unforgettable. But what tore them apart? And what secrets were buried when Glen Campbell passed away in 2017? At 66 years old, Tanya Tucker has finally broken her silence. Not in a headline, not in a song, but in a raw, emotional reflection that's left the country world stunned. And now, after years of silence and speculation, the truth about their whirlwind romance, the addiction, the heartbreak, and the bitter goodbye is finally coming out. What Tanya reveals doesn't just rewrite her story, it rewrites his legacy. And it raises one haunting question. What if Glen Campbell didn't want the truth told until now? They met at a time when both were on top of the world. Glen Campbell, already a household name with hits like Rhinestone Cowboy, and Tanya Tucker, the teenage country prodigy with a voice far beyond her years. Their romance began like a wildfire. Sudden, intense, impossible to contain. But while the world saw glitz and glamour, those close to the couple knew there was a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Tanya was only 21 when they went public, and Glen was in his 40s, recently divorced, and battling demons of his own. It was a pairing that made headlines instantly, but few knew the full extent of what was happening behind closed doors. In interviews, Tanya now hints there was more than love at play. It was a dangerous cocktail of fame, ego, and substances that neither could fully escape. And when she looks back now at 66, she says she's finally ready to tell the story that no one was supposed to hear. Because what happened next nearly destroyed them both. From the outside, Tanya Tucker and Glen Campbell looked like a Nashville fairy tale, or at least a tabloid fantasy. She was the rebellious princess of country music, barely in her 20s, and he was the legendary troubadour twice her age, known for his guitar wizardry and velvet voice. But behind the stage lights and red carpets, their relationship quickly morphed into something volatile, intense, and at times deeply unhealthy. Tanya, still carving her identity in a male-dominated industry, fell hard and fast. Glen, dealing with the aftermath of a painful divorce and a growing dependency on drugs and alcohol, latched on to Tanya with the kind of fervor that scared even his closest friends. "We were addicted to each other," Tanya has said in interviews. But addiction wasn't just emotional, it was chemical too. The couple became infamous for their partying, their fights, and their public makeups and breakups. There were nights Tanya would throw things at him, nights Glen would vanish for days, and there were times when neither could remember what had happened the night before. They brought out the worst in each other, but also something deeper, wounds from their childhoods, traumas never addressed, pain never spoken aloud. Tanya once said Glen reminded her of her father, loving, talented, but haunted. And Glen? He called Tanya his wildflower, beautiful and untamable. At award shows, they'd arrive hand in hand, smiling for cameras, even as they were falling apart inside. Behind the scenes, Tanya was being pushed to clean up her image, while Glen was spiraling deeper into substance use. But the pressure of fame, judgment from the industry, and the constant scrutiny made everything worse. They were too famous to get help, too in love to walk away, and too damaged to stay. When Tanya now looks back, she doesn't paint Glen as a villain, but as a broken man trying to survive in a world that offered no mercy. And for Tanya, being so young, so impressionable, and so tied to someone in free fall, the relationship would leave scars that shaped the rest of her life. Part 2 of her truth? It wasn't just a love story. It was a collision. The public didn't know the half of it. Behind the headlines that called them country music's hottest couple was a story unraveling at the seams. Tanya Tucker and Glen Campbell were, at times, like fire and gasoline, passionate, explosive, and impossible to contain. In private, the chaos boiled over. Tanya was barely out of her teens, and Glen was nearing his mid-40s, already a seasoned veteran in the music industry and deeply entrenched in addiction. They tried to record music together, but even those sessions were laced with tension. Glen would show up late, or not at all. Tanya would storm out in tears. Their duets, though hauntingly beautiful, were captured between arguments, disappearances, and emotional breakdowns. Yet, every time they tried to walk away, something pulled them back. Whether it was the promise of redemption or the familiarity of dysfunction, neither one could seem to break free for long. Tanya later confessed that part of her was trying to save him. She saw the brilliance in Glen even when the world saw a man falling apart. And Glen, despite the drugs and erratic behavior, clung to Tanya as a kind of anchor. A wild one, yes, but still the only person who saw his pain without judgment. But their codependency wasn't sustainable. There were moments when Glen's rage would flare, fueled by substances and paranoia. Tanya, young and feisty, wouldn't back down. Fights escalated. At times, it got physical. And yet, every breakup felt temporary, like part of a script neither could rewrite. Industry insiders tried to intervene. Friends urged Tanya to leave. Producers warned Glen he was jeopardizing his career. But the more people pushed them apart, the more they resisted. They didn't want to be told their love was toxic, even though deep down they both knew it. And then, one night, it all came crashing down. A particularly violent argument led to their final split. Tanya walked away, bruised, emotionally wrecked, but alive. Glen reportedly fell deeper into addiction after she left. He'd later marry again and continue performing, but many say he was never quite the same. For Tanya, leaving wasn't just about ending a relationship, it was about survival. In part 3, she finally began to reclaim her voice, not just as a singer, but as a woman who had lived through one of country music's most dangerous love affairs and come out the other side scarred, but unbroken. After their split, Tanya Tucker found herself in a strange and quiet place, a space where her heart ached, but her voice was still expected to perform. Fans saw the sparkle, the sass, and the voice that could shake a room to its core. But behind the curtain, she was grieving something that wasn't just a breakup. It was the death of a dream, a shattered illusion that maybe love could fix the broken parts inside her and Glen both. Instead, she was left to pick up the pieces alone. The country music world was watching closely. There were whispers at the Opry, in dressing rooms, and along Nashville's Music Row. Everyone had an opinion. Some blamed Tanya, calling her wild and uncontrollable. Others blamed Glen, labeling him a man with demons too big to slay. But very few knew the truth. Tanya wasn't just recovering from Glen. She was trying to rediscover herself. She buried herself in the work, album after album, tour after tour. But the pain would surface in her songs. If you listened close enough, you could hear the heartbreak between the lyrics. Songs like "Would You Lay With Me in a Field of Stone" took on new meaning, and even her upbeat numbers carried a shadow of melancholy. She was singing not just to the audience, but to herself, reminding her own heart that it still had something worth saying. Meanwhile, Glen Campbell spiraled deeper. He was arrested in 2003 for DUI and assaulting a police officer. His mugshot made headlines, and it broke Tanya's heart all over again. She said in later interviews that no matter how far apart they were, a part of her always cared. "You don't stop loving someone just because they hurt you," she once said. "You just learn to love them from a distance." Then came Glen's Alzheimer's diagnosis. It changed everything. Tanya, like many others who loved him once, watched from the sidelines as the man who had once electrified stadiums now struggled to remember lyrics or faces. And when Glen's farewell tour was announced, his final attempt to connect with fans before his memory faded for good, Tanya sent him a letter. She never said what it said, only that it was from the heart. In part 5, Tanya reflects on the phone call she almost made, one last conversation with Glen before the end came. But fate, as always, had other plans. There's a certain kind of silence that comes after someone you once loved is gone. Not the kind of silence you hear, but the kind you feel. Tanya Tucker sat with that silence for days after Glen Campbell passed In 2017, the world mourned a legend, but Tanya, she mourned the man. The phone call she'd been meaning to make never happened. She had held the number in her hand for weeks, maybe longer, dialed it once, then hung up before it rang. Told herself, tomorrow, I'll call tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. In interviews since, Tanya has hinted at what she might have said. Not, I forgive you, because she wasn't sure she did. And not, I love you, because that part was already understood between them. What she would have said, she claims, was simple. I hope you're okay, Glen. I hope you found peace. That message may sound small to outsiders, but between two people with that much history, it would have spoken volumes. When Glen died, Tanya didn't rush to the cameras. She didn't post tributes or pose for headlines. Instead, she retreated. Friends say she barely left her house for a while. Her team canceled a few dates, and her band didn't ask questions. They knew. This loss wasn't just professional, it was personal. She had watched him fall apart, then watched the world piece him back together in gold records and Lifetime Achievement Awards. But she had seen the man behind the legend. She had lived it. And then, one day, she sang. She didn't plan it. She didn't rehearse. She just walked onto a stage somewhere in Texas, stared into the lights, and let the words fall out. Rhinestone Cowboy, Glen's anthem. Her voice cracked by the second verse. The crowd stood in silence. By the end, she was in tears, and so were half the people watching. It wasn't just a tribute. It was a confession, a goodbye, maybe even an apology. Tanya later said, that was the last time I ever sang that song. It hurt too much. But even if she never sings it again, that moment lives on in the hearts of fans. In that instant, she wasn't Tanya Tucker, the icon. She was just a woman saying goodbye to a complicated love. And as part 6 unfolds, Tanya opens up about how that heartbreak shaped her music forever, and how Glen still shows up in the songs she writes, even when she tries to leave him behind. Tanya Tucker once said, I don't write songs, I bleed them. And when it comes to Glen Campbell, she bled plenty. Even after their relationship ended and the headlines faded, his fingerprints stayed all over her music. She didn't always name him. Sometimes he appeared as a cowboy, other times as a drifter, a ghost in the rearview mirror. But fans who listened closely knew who she was really singing about. In the years after their split, Tanya's songs took on a new kind of pain. Less teenage rebellion, more grown woman heartbreak. Tracks like Would You Lay With Me in a Field of Stone and Strong Enough to Bend weren't just country ballads. They were coded messages from a woman still trying to heal. Even in songs she didn't write, her voice carried the weight of someone who had been to hell and back in love. And much of that hell had Glen's name written on it. But here's the twist. Glen also inspired some of her most powerful performances. He didn't just break her heart, he sharpened her edges, made her tougher. And that toughness turned into gold records, Grammy nominations, and a longevity most artists only dream about. She credits him, in part, for that. Not because he supported her, but because surviving him made her unstoppable. Privately, Tanya kept a small box of mementos from their time together. A faded photo booth strip, a hotel room key, and a letter Glen once wrote on the back of a set list. In it, he scribbled the words, "You'll always be my thunderstorm." She never talked about it publicly, until now. In an emotional interview at age 66, Tanya finally opened up about that letter. "He called me his thunderstorm," she said, holding back tears, "because I came out of nowhere, shook up everything and left a mess behind. But he loved storms." That line alone stopped reporters in their tracks. It was clear. Tanya wasn't just reminiscing. She was unearthing something she'd buried for decades. The love, the regret, the music, and the scars. And it all led to one haunting question she still carries. Did he know how much I really loved him? Because sometimes, when you live fast and love hard, the words get lost. But the music remembers everything. And Tanya's music still whispers his name. Even after the headlines faded and Glen Campbell's name stopped appearing next to hers in tabloids, Tanya Tucker found herself haunted by unfinished business. She wasn't chasing closure. She was surviving the residue of a love too loud to forget, and it showed. Every time she stepped on stage, there was a part of her that still performed for him, not in longing, but in defiance. It was as if every standing ovation whispered, "I made it." But behind the spotlight was a more fragile reality. Friends close to Tanya say she would still check into certain hotels and request the exact room she once stayed in with Glen. The staff at one such hotel in Nashville remembered her lighting a single candle in the window and sitting in silence for hours. She never explained why, but those who knew her didn't need to ask. She wasn't waiting for him, a longtime bandmate once said. She was forgiving herself, because that's the part no one talks about, the guilt. Tanya often blamed herself for not being able to fix Glen. In public, she'd call him her hero, her influence. But in private, she carried the weight of his spiral like it was her cross to bear. When Glen's addiction worsened, when the arrests piled up, when his family grew distant, Tanya felt like she'd failed him, even though, deep down, she knew she couldn't save someone who didn't want saving. And when Glen was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, Tanya's world tilted again. She visited him once during his decline. The meeting was short, awkward. Glen barely recognized her. He smiled, called her "darlin'," and then drifted off. She left the room quietly, holding back tears, and never returned. He was already gone, she later admitted. Still, when he passed in 2017, Tanya didn't release a public statement right away. Instead, she disappeared for a few days. No calls, no emails. She drove out to the desert, parked her truck under the stars, and cried until she fell asleep in the driver's seat. When she finally emerged, her voice cracked on stage as she performed Delta Dawn, the song that launched her into fame at just 13. But this time, she sang it for herself, for the little girl Glen once believed in, for the woman he couldn't hold on to. At 66, Tanya now carries that history not as pain, but as armor. In interviews, when asked about Glen, she no longer dodges the question. She smiles, takes a breath, and says, "He was the love of my life, and the lesson of it too." And somehow, both statements are equally true. Tanya Tucker never wrote a tell-all memoir, but her life reads like one. Each wrinkle on her face a paragraph, each scar a footnote. And when it comes to Glen Campbell, the chapter is long, raw, and still unfinished. By the time she turned 66, Tanya had lived 1,000 lifetimes in the public eye, and yet somehow, her most intimate truths remained just out of reach, until now. In recent interviews, Tanya's tone has shifted. There's a calm in her voice, a measured honesty that suggests she's finally ready to confront what's been buried beneath rhinestones and steel guitar strings. "People think they know what happened between me and Glen," she said in one emotional sit-down. "But the truth is, I didn't even understand it until I looked back with clear eyes. I wasn't just in love, I was addicted to the chaos." That chaos had its roots in more than just bad decisions. Tanya revealed that during their relationship, she often felt like a caretaker instead of a partner. She was in her 20s, wild, impulsive, and carrying the weight of her own fame, and yet she spent nights watching over a man twice her age as he stumbled through addiction and mood swings. "I loved him," she said plainly. But sometimes love means sitting on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m., making sure he doesn't choke on his own demons. But perhaps the most gut-wrenching part of Tanya's recent revelations was this. She once thought she'd marry Glen, not because of a fairy tale dream, but because they were bonded by survival. She stayed even when he broke things, even when he vanished for days, even when the whispers in the industry told her to run. "I thought we'd make it," she admitted. "I thought he'd get clean. I thought I could fix him." Years later, after Glen married Kim Woolen and began a new chapter, Tanya felt both relieved and strangely betrayed. She watched him settle down, find some stability, and battle his disease with grace, and wondered why he couldn't have done that with her. "He got better," she said, "but not with me, and that's a strange kind of heartbreak." Still, she carries no bitterness, just memory. Memory of the man who once held her hand on stage and whispered, "You're gonna be a star." Memory of the broken promises, the dizzy highs, the cruel lows. And in those memories, Tanya has finally found peace, not by rewriting the past, but by finally understanding it. And she's not done. One final truth remains. At 66, Tanya Tucker doesn't just carry stories, she carries ghosts. And the biggest one of all still lingers every time someone mentions Glen Campbell's name. In her final reflections, Tanya didn't shy away from the truth. She faced it, bruises and all. And what she shared shocked even those who thought they knew everything. "I never got to say goodbye the way I needed to," she confessed. When Glen was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, Tanya was one of the first to reach out privately. She never made a public scene or tried to reclaim old territory. She just wanted to see him one last time when he could still remember her face. But according to Tanya, that reunion never came. "They kept him away from me," she said, her voice low and tired. "Maybe it was for the best, maybe not, but I'll never know what he would have said if he saw me one last time. I'll never know if he forgave me, or if I forgave him." Her heartbreak came not just from lost love, but from the way Glen's story ended. "I knew him when he was sharp as a whip, singing like an angel, playing that guitar like it was a piece of his soul," she recalled. "And then I watched him disappear, one memory at a time." Tanya took the pain and did what she always does. She put it in a song. In 2019, she released While I'm Livin', an album full of raw, stripped-down emotion. And though it wasn't marketed as such, many fans and critics believe several tracks were secretly about Glen. "Some things I just couldn't say directly," she admitted, "but you'll find him in the melodies." Today, Tanya visits Glen's grave in quiet moments, away from the cameras. She doesn't bring flowers, she brings a story, a lyric, a memory. She whispers to him about the stages she still plays, the awards she never thought she'd win, and the love she's still trying to understand. "Maybe he hears me," she said once with a shrug, "or maybe he's finally at peace. Either way, I'm okay now." The woman once known for her rebellious spirit, her wild love, and her defiant voice has nothing left to hide. In finally telling the truth about Glen Campbell, Tanya Tucker didn't just open a door to the past, she closed one. And behind it, she left the pain, the what-ifs, and the headlines. What remains is something purer. Two artists whose stars collided, burned bright, and then broke apart, but left behind light that still lingers in every note.